Dear Professor Graham Hassall, thank you for joining me today. You have devoted your professional life to the study and understanding of the Pacific and its people. You have done this through research and teaching at universities in the Pacific region, but also through engagement with governance and public policy. You have operated across disciplines such as history, comparative constitutional law, governance, public policy, public administration, and global studies. You have taught at universities such as the University of Melbourne, the University of Papua New Guinea, Nagoya University in Japan, the University of South Pacific in Fiji, and the Victoria University of Wellington in New Zealand, just to mention a few. You are also a founding member of the New Zealand Centre for Global Studies, a non-profit organization and think tank that conducts research and policy analysis on global affairs and New Zealand's role within that realm. I mention this to highlight there is a global dimension to your work on governance and public policy. I thought we could start with a general question, if that is okay with you. And this is a broad question. What has been the driving force behind your career and life's work? What basically drives your life's work?
Thanks, Philip. It's an interest in seeing the world as a global system, but coming from my part of the world, having been born and raised in Australia, which is so far from what is commonly regarded as the major centers of the world. It's seen as an outlier, as an outpost. But through the 20th century, the connections between what happens in Australia and what happens in the rest of the world rapidly increased. The distances decreased. So the idea of being global-minded, but how do you do that from a remote part of the world? And I came to understand that the center of the world, in a sense, is wherever one lives. And I learned this by traveling the Pacific and finding out that if you're talking to people on a small island, they don't see New York or Paris or Geneva as the center of the world, or Beijing. They see their island as the center around which revolve everything else. So the driving motivation was being brought up in the Baha'i tradition of trying to think in a global-minded way. And how do you do that from an outpost such as Sydney, Australia, which is so far distant from the major capitals of the world, the major, the major powers of the world? And the next question I had was, well, if I'm not really part of Europe or part of North America, not part of the Northern Hemisphere, I'm in the Southern Hemisphere, who are my neighbors? Who are the peoples that I'm most connected to? And so that brought me back to looking at my own society, the one in which I grew up, and all the complexities that are there, the tensions and potentials, but also then my neighbors. And I was always acutely aware of the fact that my neighbors are the peoples of the Pacific, but specifically Melanesia, who very seldom figured in any histories that we learned at school. So we learned of the Western tradition. So you're growing up in Australia, you're learning about Western civilization, but you're not learning about your own neighbors. And so I had in mind, as I grew through my really young years into my teen years, that I wanted to learn about my neighbors. So that was part of the driving force. I didn't know which subject to focus on. And you mentioned my interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary background. That was simply because I wasn't so concerned about whether I became a lawyer or a sociologist, an anthropologist, or an economist. But I just wanted to know in general about the environment in which I grew. So I think that in the end, my interest was historical more than other fields. But that interest in history leads one to an interest in the contemporary period and reflection on the future. I find that historians are futurists. So that's in brief, the the origin of my interest in global studies coming out of a Pacific perspective, but in a multidisciplinary manner.
Thank you. That was really interesting for me, and just beautiful to hear. Okay, can we then talk about the Pacific Islands, or rather about the Pacific Island countries, as you like to call them? I have a map which I might try to share. Um, I think the geography, the size, the culture, and the history of the Pacific Islands region and the challenges it faces point to a quite unique story. This story also reveals a lot about the character of the global system and the challenges in the global system. So maybe we can start with the first, like geography, size, history, any of that context, and then advance towards the global level of the discussion by touching on challenges regarding decolonization, the economy and development, governance and government, public policy, regional integration, and globalization and the global system. There's a lot there, but you have written on all of these things. So, whatever you would like to cover, and I'll try to share the map that I think I have. Thank you. Hopefully, you will not tell me that the map is completely inappropriate. uh, Maybe I need to make it slightly bigger.
I'm not sure whether you want to pose a question about this map to get us started. What do you now? How would you like to enter into this complex field of? There's so
Well,
much to say.
I think some of the history shows in the map because you can see that some islands correspond to Western countries or to New Zealand or Australia, and others do not. And then the other thing I think you can see, not very well represented, but to some degree represented, is how these are not simple single unitary territories, but there are many, many, many islands, and I don't even know how you pronounce it, atoll.
Mm.
So like you are talking about, like when you speak about Solomon Islands, you are talking about a lot of islands. Or when you speak about
Yes,
Fiji, you talk about a lot of islands as
yes,
well. And so
yes.
that
Hundreds. Yes.
changes the culture, the economics, and I think that's one of the unique parts. And in that respect, the map is useful. It is also useful because it has these allegedly free regions, and not everyone is very familiar. So it's good to start with a map so you have an idea what we are talking about. Yeah, so I can keep
Okay.
this on for as long as you
Yes.
like.
Okay. We'll start with this. This is a very contested map. The uh, some people would completely reject the concept that there is a Melanesia, Polynesia, Micronesia.
Hmm.
But if we don't use those divisions, then how do we describe Southwest Pacific or Eastern Pacific, Northern Pacific? So this is um, a in a sense a schema that was originated maybe 150 or so years ago, and it partly describes people by their cultural type, and it partly describes by their geography. So because each island group is unique, we have to be very careful with generalizations, but we are making some generalizations to start this introduction to the Pacific. One thing we notice that we have very small land masses spread across an incredibly large ocean. And indeed, even these spots on this map are in no way to scale. If they were to scale, the spots wouldn't appear. So the land masses are very small. And as you said, that does have a huge impact on the sociology, the politics, the economics, the philosophies of these people. Well, gee, there's so many different places to start with this. There is one strand of Pacific studies that tries to look at the the origins of these peoples, their migration routes. Some people say that the origins were from South America. Some say that the origins are from East Asia, coming down from China and from Southeast Asia, and some say even that there's influence from the subcontinent. Now, there's a difference in the physical appearance of these people, so that obviously the people further to the north in Micronesia tend to have more of an Asian influence on their culture and physical appearance. The people in the east in Polynesia tend to well, you can tell Polynesian people by their physical appearance, but also by their political structure, which I can go into if we want to go in that direction. And the reference to Melanesia refers to melanin in the skin of darker peoples, so that basically the people of the Southwest Pacific have a darker skin tone to those of Micronesia, Polynesia, and can easily be distinguished. I've met people from Vanuatu, New Caledonia, even Papua New Guinea, who to look African in appearance. But they're thousands of years in this part of the world. Now, each of these three subregions, within these three subregions, there's an immense variety of peoples and political types as well. So you can see the largest landmass is in Melanesia, that's Papua New Guinea. And that country of Papua New Guinea is the largest population of all the Pacific states. With a population of roughly 9 million, it's hard to tell because it's not known how accurate the census has been, and it's the only Pacific country that shares a landmass with another neighbor, and that's Indonesia, formerly a Dutch territory. So we've identified that for all of these island groups, their neighbors were only reached by sea. They were navigators, and they used that navigation for trade and for all types of intricate relations with their neighbors. And there's a strong link between the Maori of New Zealand to the south. This map has New Zealand as part of Polynesia because New Zealand was a British dominion or colony. And not everybody would regard it as being part of Polynesia, but there is an extensive influence of Polynesians within New Zealand who are referred to as Pacifica peoples in New Zealand. And you'll see also that this map doesn't include Australia as part of the Pacific, and yet politically Australia asserts itself as a Pacific country and wants to be part of Pacific economic communities and political communities. So there's a lot of dynamics going on just within this map. The other thing about this map, what it does lack is a distinction between exclusive economic zones, which are under the sovereignty of the Pacific nations, and international waters. There's a difference in law between what can occur in international waters and what can occur in national sovereign waters. And that brings up the topic of, for example, fishing, and also the movement of military vessels through the region. Another aspect of this map is to note that virtually all of these Pacific peoples were subject to colonial rule. The only people who, in a sense, were not subject to colonial authority were the Tongans, who allowed themselves to come under the protection of the British without being fully colonized. But each of these other peoples were subject to colonization or annexation. You have the state of Hawaii, which is part of the US, which required the complete cessation of the Hawaiian monarchy. There's just so much in this map. So what this map denotes in historical sense is that each of these peoples was sovereign. They weren't nations. They were island communities and ethnic communities in relations with their neighbors who knew nothing of nation states. They knew nothing of being colonized by outside powers, as in the Europeans, the Spaniards, the Americans, the Australians, the British, the Germans. But that was their experience from the 17th century on into the 19th century. And the experience of the 20th century was decolonization. That decolonization is incomplete, particularly for the French territories, which are, in a strictly legal sense, a part of France, in a strictly legal sense, a part of the state of France. And some of the American territories, which were in very complex relationships to the United States. And so the term Pacific Island countries is preferred to Pacific Island nations. So the Pacific peoples, particularly when they come to their regional groupings and organizations, do not distinguish between whether a country is a dependent territory or an independent territory. It is only concerned about the unity of Pacific peoples. So you have some organizations that only admit sovereign states, and other organizations that say, regardless of whether you are sovereign or non-sovereign, you are part of this Pacific community and need to come under the umbrella of Pacific regionalism. So that, in a nutshell, is some of the background to the complex geography and politics and ethnography of these Pacific peoples. And in that in itself is only a brief overview of the complexity that is in place in this map.
I want to mention a few things I've learned from your work here, which I think will help the discussion further. So there is huge ethnic diversity because there are many islands in each of these areas, more than we see on the map. We have different levels of dependence and independence. There's something in your book that you refer to as free association, which is a sort of in between independence and dependence, continued dependence. I think when we look at the region, a lot of the colonization also had to do with geostrategic position, or a lot of the, maybe I would argue, the free association continued status has to do a lot uh, with geostrategic positioning, because it's a key, especially now with China and the United States. Micronesia, I think, has always been an area of great geostrategic importance for military bases and so forth. So some of those free association agreements probably involve military bases or something of that kind. I don't want to speak too much about it, but just to discuss. Also, there's lots of villages which you mentioned. So there's a village structure which I to and and this village structure, I think we'll discuss later, makes very complex the task of government and governance in a framework of a nation state, as has been developed since colonization and after. I think it's worth mentioning something that you know probably too well to mention, that there is, a lot of the islands are subject to climate change. Some are low-lying islands, and so they are quite exposed. Then there are maybe more frequent cyclones because of the climate change problem. And there's also active volcanoes and earthquakes, and so that these elements also play out into the politics and the global politics that this region engages with. I like this notion that there is a sort of ocean ownership. These countries apparently prefer to call themselves large ocean countries. And that is not just metaphorical, because each island owns rights to the ocean, something like 200 nautical miles from its territory. That actually means, because these islands are very widespread, there's a lot of ocean that is, in a sense, that these islands, these territories have rights over. And maybe, maybe that will be something we discuss. And yeah, I think that's a good maybe way to start with this. Can we maybe go to, I don't know what you would prefer. Do you prefer, so there's three topics I think I want to cover in the next phase. Maybe it depends on you what you want to start with. So
Well, you've
culture.
mentioned a couple of. Uh, it's up to you, Philip. You've mentioned the interesting question of uh, uh, um, free association, which is an in-between status. You've mentioned the security aspects. You've mentioned climate change. So, whichever direction we want to go with this series of topics.
If you want to add to any of that, please do, and then I'll
Okay. Well,
continue.
there's so much on the security aspect of it, that the some of the first action in the First World War happened in the Pacific, and that was specifically we had German colonies in New Guinea and in German Samoa. And when World War One broke out, Australian forces went and took the German outposts in New Guinea without too much combat. And similarly in German Samoa. In Samoa, in fact, it was just Samoa, but it was under German control. At the conclusion of the First World War and the formation of the League of Nations, the Micronesian territories were placed under Japanese control as a mandate of the League of Nations. And unfortunately, from that platform, the Japanese developed their bases from which they launched their attacks onto US bases in Hawaii. And a lot of the combat in the Second World War involved Allied forces pushing the Japanese back out of Melanesia and Micronesia all the way back to Japan. So the Pacific peoples experienced significant combat and significant, not all of them, but those areas in which there had been Japanese occupation and fierce battles. For example, in Solomon Islands, the Battle of Guadalcanal, there are all the battles that took place through the islands of Micronesia as well. And on the island of New Guinea, there was ferocious fighting there. That was as far as the Japanese came. But this was it cuts like a knife through the history of these peoples, just as it did in the Dutch in what became Indonesia. That the Japanese came and took over that colony, and the defeat of the Japanese created like a knife slicing through colonial rule, which would not have ended without that slicing, and allowed the Pacific peoples to start thinking, well, what do we do now? And the colonies officially they were under the United Nations. They were trusteeships, so-called trusteeships under the United Nations. But the Pacific peoples weren't asked if they wanted these trusteeships. Now, there's a valid debate as to whether they were prepared to govern themselves as nations because they had no experience of that. But on the other hand, some peoples, particularly the Samoans and others as well, felt that they could do just as well as any colonial authority, and they resisted those trusteeships of the UN. So we're talking about the topic of security. Under the United Nations trusteeships, Micronesia was delivered to the United States as a special trusteeship, which was a security trusteeship, and the Micronesians were not allowed to travel out of that region, and nobody was allowed to travel into the region unless they were part of the military and the Navy into the 1960s. And during this period also, there was atmospheric testing of nuclear weapons. So these experiences cultivated in the Pacific leaders and Pacific people, the people who were aware of this, cultivated a great sensitivity to nuclear weapons, to warfare in general, to the need for peaceful resolution of conflicts, and to the assertion of Pacific sovereignty. So the theme from the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and to the present has been not only the establishment of sovereignty of the Pacific peoples, but then the ability of that voice to be heard in global assemblies. And that's where the link comes from Pacific studies, Pacific history, into the effectiveness of international organizations, such as the International Court of Justice, or the General Assembly, or the Security Council. So even though there have been significant struggles within the Pacific, some civil war, some civil unrest, some other disputes between Pacific countries and other countries, they've had very little attention from the UN Security Council because the numbers involved are small. They're seen as minor clashes. So something that's very significant within the region is seen as minor by the global community. So that's the security aspect is a very significant one. It's developed a sensitivity amongst the Pacific peoples to the need for a cessation not only of atmospheric testing, but of all nuclear testing, and to the ownership of nuclear weapons. They have been at the forefront of international treaty formation, outlawing the acquisition and use of nuclear weapons. Those international treaties are not yet enforced because they haven't reached the required numbers, but they are treaties that are open to signing. Now, related to that security issue is an environment, because you mentioned sea level rise, climate change. The Pacific states are most subject to sea level rise, ocean warming, leading to more significant, what they call adverse weather events, cyclones, and the like. That's apart from the volcanic activity and earthquakes, which are part of the natural phenomena. So they are highly sensitive to the need for mitigation and adaptation for the effects of climate change, but they are not emitters of carbon. They're not industrial countries. So their message to the global community is that they didn't cause the problem of climate change. They only received the adverse effects of it. So they are at the forefront of all of the international meetings advocating global responses to the need for mitigation of climate change, particularly, the sort of the carbon emissions. They can't do much about that because they don't emit much carbon. Only small things that they can do there. There are organizations such as the Alliance of Small Island States, which have been at the forefront of the climate change meetings under the Paris Agreement. Yeah, so that's that aspect of it. So there's these very close connections between what's happening locally on the ground and global public policy on these matters.
That's great. Thank you. I think that leads us quite nicely into talking about politics and the distinction you make between life world and the system, the terms from Habermas, which allows for, discussing culture as well. I think both culture and decolonization, the colonization, decolonization experience plays into the political systems that have emerged and the challenges that are there. So I think it comes naturally as a continuation to that discussion. Yeah, whatever you would like to say there.
Okay, well, I've mentioned that island groups and even groups within an island traditionally had their own sovereignty. They could make peace, they could make war, they could move house on their land, they could cultivate as they pleased. And then as they became colonized, all of those sovereign rights were removed from them, and some in a very harsh way. And there's the cultural dimension to the imposition of Christian mission standards, which was a Victorian Puritan standards, whether it came from North America or from Europe, that had a significant impact on the culture. We could talk about that separately. But we're talking about the governance systems. Obviously, on each and every island and within every village, they had a system of governance which had operated for thousands of years. How they chose their leaders, how those leaders worked with the general population, relations between males and females in both in their political stances, their land rights, their economic activities. And there was these societies had formed stable operating procedures. Now, when those are knocked out under colonial conditions, new systems were brought in which were foreign to them, alien to them. And you mentioned the model that Habermas developed, observing European history, that in a sense he said that rules come out of the life world. People live, when they have a problem, they make a rule. And that rule, then if they agree on the rule, then that solves that problem. Everybody agrees and they move on. Now, the essence of the colonial imposition is that the rules don't come from within the system. The rules come from outside the system. So I write in my work that it's an inversion of Habermas, that what's happening is that there's an imposition of a governance system onto the life world, and now the life world is talking back to that system, saying, "Well, we don't want to operate in those ways." But the question is, what do they change? And can they? Is it a matter of going? You don't want. The problem is if you go back to a sort of a chiefly society or a communal society, you can't reinvent. You can't go back to a past position, either of politics or economics, because life has moved on. People don't want to be totally agrarian or a fishing community. They don't want to subject their women. They don't want to have slave systems of subordination. So they do want equality. So how do you match, if you're going to go back to a chiefly system in which chiefs had power of life and death, just as the modern state does now? The state has the ability to impose its rule on and on behalf of the people, to incarcerate people or to take their life, whatever the standard is. But if you give that back to a chiefly combination of authority, is that going to work? And societies have become more complex now. So we take, for example, the distribution of land. There's no doubt that most land was acquired through force, as it was in Europe, as it was in the Pacific. And so you get examples of these Germans coming into Samoa, the Australians going to Papua New Guinea, and they're saying, just stop fighting over land, determine demarcate the land and live on that land. But when they call it pacification. They pacified these peoples, but it doesn't mean that they pacified it along just lines of land distribution. So that at the time that the colonial imposition occurred, whoever happened to be dominant at that time in terms of land ownership and got the best land the most fruitful land, etc., were in place. And those who at that current time were the losers, they had less arable land, smaller land compared to their community size, etc. So there was an injustice built in there. So struggles over land continue to the present time. And the question of whether you demarcate land by customary identification or you move to some more technologically making lines that are straight, done by laser, etc., done by latitude and longitude, which was foreign to past eras. So there's this mixing of modern systems with traditional, and so it needs a. So what I'm talking about, this negotiation between what was traditional and should be revived, and what was traditional and should be left behind. And this is a constant navigation. You take education systems. People might lament that modern education in the Pacific is just a cut and paste of European systems of putting children in classrooms and turning them all out with the same stamp on them of the sort of learning that they have. But if you take that away, what do you put in its place? What is education now? You can't go back to just saying, well, you're male, so therefore you must learn fishing and fighting and hunting and making a house. So that is traditional learning, but that's not sufficient for modern times. You need people who are learning to be all sorts of tradesmen. You need people in government. You need policymakers. You need technical people, etc. But you don't want to lose their culture. So you can start to see from this that there's this tension between wanting to have the traditions of the past, the values of the past, but also taking the best of the modern era, technologically, sociologically, also in terms of popular culture. And it's a mix of all of these, and it's still being played out in island after island.
I like someone you quote in your book who says that basically the states in the Pacific, they have no mandate from the people to continue operating the ex-colonial state machinery on which their own political survival depends. And I think that highlights it quite well, because there is an ex-colonial state machinery that has been put into place, but then it's being changed in different ways and contested and hopefully transformed, and that's where the culture comes in. But that doesn't mean that at times, at least when I read your book uh, on this topic, that I don't sometimes wonder if some of this machinery is not really a sort of form, like forms without substance. So you for example, we can maybe talk, this would be a good area. Let's talk about the three branches. You mentioned the chiefs, and the chiefs are sometimes mentioned as the fourth branch, in addition to the three classic branches of constitutional democracies, I guess. So you have the executive, the legislative, and the juridical. And maybe we can talk about the challenges that come from that have developed around these branches in terms of how the model has actually been implemented in reality,
Okay.
especially.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. Well, one interesting observation is that the myth is that each of the independent states and the constitutions they're based on were freely entered into by the people of those new countries. The first observation is if they were formerly under a colony that a colonial power that was republican in nature, say the American colonies, or the French, although the French they haven't got decolonization yet, but they carry a French model of governance. So they will have a presidential system and the appointment of executive under the Republican model of appointment. If, on the other hand, they came from the Westminster tradition, they have adopted systems that are fundamentally Westminster, in which, as you know, under the English model, as exported around the world, you elect local representatives to a national parliament, and that parliament elects a leader who will be the head of the executive. So that's the model. There's the question, however, of how you form majorities in a Westminster Parliament and the role of political parties. So political parties have proliferated throughout the Pacific as part of the introduced model, and yet they don't have much of a social or intellectual basis in the Pacific societies. So political parties are more likely based on personalities or on calculations of the possibility of obtaining executive power. Because they're not based on philosophies, it's quite easy for a member of a constituency to jump from one party to another, because it's not ideological. It's much more politically motivated, and it's based on the calculation of numbers and the popularity of and ability of leaders. So this has led to a great level of instability in the Pacific parliaments that are Westminster, because there's very little glue holding together the parties that form the executive. And as you know, under Westminster, even though a parliament might be elected, whether it was a 3-year term, a 4-year term, a 5-year term, they vary throughout the Pacific. At any sitting day of parliament, someone might enter a motion of no confidence, which is the value of Westminster, that it keeps the government on their toes every day. But without some moderation of the use of that vote of no confidence, it would routinely be introduced each and every time Parliament sat, because those who were not in power wanted to be in power. But there was the basis on which they put in a motion of no confidence might be quite flimsy, not based on the actual conduct of that government. So a couple of things happened in response to this. One is that executives started to convene their parliaments for as few days as possible in the year. In other words, they'd look at the Constitution and say, what is the minimum number of days that are needed to sit? Because they knew that any more than that would risk these introduction of these votes of no confidence, motions of no confidence. So this has been quite a damaging a tendency particularly in Melanesia, where they're full Westminster, because the work of Parliament doesn't get done. And that's what I write in my book. I write in a gentle way, but just point out that if Parliament doesn't meet, then reports of executive departments don't get tabled. They don't get sent to committee. If legislation is introduced as bills, it doesn't spend time in committee to the extent that it should. So basically, Westminster is not operating in the fullest manner. Now, these countries know this as well, so they need a solution. So one of the solutions, particularly in Papua New Guinea, was that they banned a motion of no confidence in the first 18 months of a term. They have a 5-year term. They say, okay, in the first 18 months, you can't introduce a motion, and I think in the last 6 months or the last year, so that there's a period in which there's more instability. So they're trying to find ways to continue with a democratic process, but also one that brings stability. So there's a great amount of effort being put into the development of parliamentary practices, but with these constraints of the weakness of Parliament in the Pacific. And part of the work I've tried to do is to see the number of laws that have been introduced over the years into these countries as compared to maybe the number of laws that need to be revised. So you might find laws that have been on the books since colonial period and require revision, but get nowhere near the parliamentary floor because the Parliament's not meeting sufficient number of days to get to the non-urgent matters. So that's one aspect of Westminster. But what's the alternative? I mean, if you desire a dictator, or you desire a presidential system in which one person holds power for the 5 years, you can go in the other direction, that there's a use of power by a party without any limits on its use. So there's two extremes here that the Pacific states are trying to avoid. One is unstable systems of democracy, and the other is closer to autocratic systems that have so much stability that they operate with impunity. Now, there are very other areas that really need more investigation, and that is the relationship between a democratic system and the levels of education and awareness of the citizenry. So it's in a sense, an understood premise of democracy that they work best when the people are educated and knowing and informed of what the choices are. I lived for a decade in New Zealand, and I saw a strong democracy at work. And what I mean by that is that there was the regular play of political forces in Parliament. But if a government introduced a bill that was so extreme to one extent or another that it went beyond the moral acceptability of the general population of New Zealand, that general population will be on the steps of Parliament within a week. And if you look up, look up demonstrations at the New Zealand Parliament, Westminster, you'll see that the people come out in the streets when a bill is beyond what they regard as constitutionally acceptable. And I haven't seen that happen in any Pacific country. And it's because the levels of awareness and empowerment of citizens hasn't reached that stage so they're not always happy with a leader or a proposed piece of legislation or an action of government. But that awareness doesn't spread evenly through that society, through lack of media coverage, lack of general education, and also because most people have other concerns, which is just getting through their day on a very meager wage. They can't necessarily go into the capital. They don't have time to sit on the steps of the capital. They don't have the personal resources to take a couple of weeks off work. So all these factors come into play. So it means that the democratic process in some parts of the Pacific is still in maturing stages. But having said that, I believe that Papua New Guinea is one of the most democratic countries I've seen. That people express themselves forthrightly and courageously. Some people call that a volatile country. But on the other hand, people feel free to speak, and they do speak their mind. They just the question of how that can be done effectively. If we're talking about this whole theme of forming a system that comes out of the life world, that hasn't solidified yet. So there's some other elements to this, which is to do with the nature of ethnicity. Many of the Pacific states are clan-based ethnic communities that have their own leadership, which is traditional style. And there's a constant debate concerning the extent to which ethnic unity and coherence carries over into civic coherence. Should we think that everybody who has the same ethnicity thinks the same or has the same interests? Or are people more individualistic than that and free to speak their mind? So these are the types of, let's say, life world questions that are still in play. And if you have this model in mind, and then you look at current affairs in the states, you can see these things playing out. So in parts of the Pacific, there's a system called Wantok, which is that loyalty to one's clan is a higher value than loyalty to a citizen. And this is played out, for example, in the public service, which is one of the areas that I deal with. Um, if you are a head of a department, who do you trust most? Somebody from your ethnic group, or someone who's not the ethnic group but is well trained and has good set of values? Who do you give a promotion to, or who do you employ? And what are the rules around that? And this is constantly in play. It's in the public, it's in the media all the time. Was this person appointed because of their ethnicity or because of their ability? And of these two, which is the right way? So these are examples of where philosophic questions from the life world are speaking back to the system, say the public service system or the political system, see what is the fairest way to move forward.
I want to just throw a few things in for discussion here. Um, I'm so part of me is interested in some of the excessive consequences of all of that. Um, and I talking about, for example, talking about votes of non-confidence, that leads to political instability, but it also may lead to a situation where the government is, or the coalition in power is constantly trying to appease the critics or the opponents and also to bolster their own position. So it's all about survival. And that can lead to things like patronage and clientelism. And you give jobs to particular members of subgroups that are would help you in your coalition, or even to your opponent, so because then the vote of no confidence might be postponed or cancelled. And so there is a bit of that which would emerge because of political instability. Then there is the issue of traditional uh, the traditional impact, the traditional culture and its impact in a modern context. So the structure of the chiefs arguably cannot operate the same way as it had been when it was created, because the context has changed. And for example, you mentioned this in your book, you have moved to a cash economy, and a cash economy means that you can collect, save money long term. It's not like before you might have owned, I don't know, cattle, fish, things that don't withstand time, and so you would have to share those with those around you as part of your transactional maybe approach to a base of support. This transactional approach continues, but it's very one-sided in a cash economy, and so that gives more power in some cases to particular chiefs, especially if they have been also able to secure land rights in one way or another by really being very aware of how to maneuver the law, which is complex, I guess. And then you also have the culture that apparently also, I say this from your book, a culture where there is an emphasis on unity and much less on adversarial models of governance. And so in short, there is less appetite for an opposition culturally. And then parliaments as well are not well funded enough by the government, which means that members of parliament probably tend to align with the government so that they can secure further positions and privilege beyond their terms in parliament. And all of that plays into a sort of area where the system becomes centralized around the government. The government is desperate to reward those it needs to reward to stay in power. There's a, there is a transactional approach, and that leaves out the poor and those who don't have any leverage over these actors. And so there is a gap there where some of the excesses can lead to something like state capture, elite capture in the most extreme cases. I don't know. Does it sound right what I said? Is it not terribly wrong?
Yes. So, there are different readings of the Pacific, and in the back of my book on government and public policy in the Pacific, I set out three scenarios. I don't know if you got to. I don't know if I highlighted it to you. And there is a deterioration scenario in which all of those things, which certainly they currently exist, and that there is the potential for them to continue. A completely transactional approach to the use of public power, in which those parties who have the power and have the treasury do the transacting. So that's exactly right. There's also a status quo option, which I don't think is sufficient, because all of those things you describe are happening now. So they can either get worse or they can continue to be the case. The only option is to find some ways to do some transformation through taking on stronger standards of public life. Those choices are there to be made. And in many ways, they are being made. There are strong mechanisms of accountability. Public awareness is growing. Technology is enabling this. During my time in the Pacific, there's been a rapid expansion of telecommunications, which allow even the most remote village people to be aware of what's happening, both economically for their own lives, but also politically, socially, and certainly in the field of entertainment and awareness of the world. So these are the positive things that are happening. Well, out of all of that, see, I'm saying there are options, and everything is possible. There are areas of deterioration. There's a lot of corruption in the Pacific, but there's also many people who are realizing that that is not the way to the future. They've experienced it, whether it's petty corruption, grand corruption, state capture. It's all been experienced, and from that experience, the society as a whole is making choices as to which way to go forward.
I mean, these challenges are everywhere.
There's challenges
We're
everywhere,
not, yeah.
and so I think one of the interesting things is that some people focus on rules and laws, and the Pacific states have all the laws. There's laws are being brought in all the time, and there's lots of policy. There's lots of rules, but it's the values that will make the difference, because it's the values that inform how a public servant will act, and also how a commercial actor will act when they go to government seeking a contract. But when I say that there's room for transformation and it's happening, for example, around, we'll say something like the whole field of awarding of contracts. It used to be secret, hidden, unknown, and it's becoming much more transparent in that process. And so these are ways in which it's becoming sort of just sort of more awareness around who's bidding for a government contract, what the conditions are, and the conditions under which contracts were awarded. There might be sort of road construction or other large civic projects. So there is forward progress in these ways. And there's also courageous reporting on corruption. There are ombudsmen in the Pacific. There's the auditor generals in the Pacific do an admirable job. And you started to talk about the three branches of government. The judicial branch in the Pacific has really held a lot of the countries together by being upright in decisions on highly sensitive political matters of whether governments stand or fall. And all these things are in the academic literature, in the legal literature. So there is progress being made in these ways.
Thank you. I can't wait now to switch to economics and maybe development, but first economics. I'm very curious about this. I have lots of questions. It's an area where, after reading your book, I really feel like I don't fully understand how it works. I understand the different parts of that I've seen described, but I have lots of questions, so I'll just kind of throw a few towards you. So I know that part of the tourism must be for sure part of the economy. So that I have in my general background. But then on the one hand, there are state-owned enterprises which play a big role. And there are even sovereign wealth funds. And that to me sounds a bit like state capitalism. On the other hand, there is a subsistence economy, which is classified as part of the informal sector. So things like fishing, farming, weaving, and carving. And so that's part of the informal sector. It's a subsistence economy. And then you have the market economy or whatever the normal economy, whatever we would call it. And this is also sort of combination between the traditional economy and modern economy. And then you also have, it seems, a large part of the economy, at least for some regions or countries, um, a large part of the economy seems to depend on remittances from, I don't know, maybe Australia, New Zealand, and maybe United States, which means that basically they rely on migrants sending back, transferring money from abroad back home to their families and so on. And then you also have considerable financial aid as part of the world of development. And that's important money coming in to the economy. So there's all these aspects, but then there is a discussion of how these countries suffer from a lack of scale and from isolation from markets, and that it's difficult to identify what they contribute that has a competitive advantage on the global market, right? So these are some of the issues, and I think in the background there are two very interesting issues. One issue is land ownership and how it works. This has completely puzzled me. I have written somewhere who owns the land as one of my key questions, and because even the big cities of some of the key countries, they lease the land from someone. The land is not theirs. So that's one part. But the other part in the background is the the taxation issue, that there are um, some countries don't really have a personal income tax regime, which is very, very strange for me, coming from countries that have always had that. And a significant problem because if you don't have that, then it means that whichever other way you tax through, I don't know, through other taxes on commercial activity or public goods, or private goods, that just means there's high inequality or higher inequality than there would be because everybody gets taxed the same and that impacts the rich and the poor very differently. So that those are some of the topics I would like to hear about if possible.
And you've certainly listed such a catalogue of important issues there. Let's see how we go. We mentioned in the beginning that each of these countries has a very small land mass. The only significant land mass is the island of New Guinea, which is the country of Papua New Guinea, and some of its smaller islands, Bougainville. And then in the Solomon Islands, there are the next level of land mass. But after that, you get to the microstates, in which, because they're small in size and population, you've rightly pointed to a couple of elements that go with that. One is that they don't have economy of scale for anything they produce. It's not economically feasible to sell it competitively on the global markets. So there's a whole subtopic here of efforts to sell to the New Zealand agricultural market, the Australian agricultural market. There's efforts to have a sugar industry in Fiji. And although you do have these industries, but they're not globally competitive. So they only exist under systems of preferential trade. And those systems were with the Europeans under the Loam Conventions, which have mostly expired, so that there's no preferential trade. So what else have you got? You don't have large landmass. You've got ocean resources. You've got fishing. Now you've got small scale fishing, which is for local markets, just people going out with their family groups and fishing for the local market and having a subsistence level of economy. And the same agriculturally, you've got farmers who are producing fruit and vegetables for local markets, and they're making the living. The markets flourish. There are people in the markets 24 hours a day selling to local market, but you're talking about large-scale economy. Where's the economy? Well, one is with migratory fish stocks, salmon and tuna, which are sold to the global market. And the struggle has been to have the Pacific states negotiate on the world markets as a solid unit as compared to individually, and to get the best rates. And there's a tuna authority that looks at that, and there's a fisheries authorities trying to ensure that the best returns come to the Pacific states. But when you get beyond fisheries, then you get into controversial areas like deep sea mining of minerals. And there's a lot of exploration going on because there's wealth on the seafloor. But you get a clash between the Pacific value of preserving nature and exploiting it for commercial gain. And that's an example of a very complex subject that is being examined, is being explored. There are exploratory operations in place to see whether deep sea mining is commercially viable and environmentally sustainable. Now, when you get beyond those, you've got some forestry where there is a landmass, and there are concerns about the returns on the forestry and the sustainability and the legality of logging operations, etc. So they're problematic as well. Now, we started to talk at the beginning about the dilemmas between going back to traditional lifestyles or going to modern lifestyles. And if you're talking about going to traditional lifestyles, you're talking about subsistence farming, subsistence in which you don't have cash. So are you heading toward cash economies in which people earn income and have cash to exchange for goods, or you're sending them back to their farmlands to do agricultural subsistence activities? It's a huge dilemma. Maybe 90% of Papua New Guinea's population live in villages. They have very little cash. They're surviving through systems, subsistence barter and exchange, but they've got minerals. So they've got natural gas, they've got oil, they've got gold, they've got copper, and this is large money. So you get to the question of who has the rights to exploit, and what revenues go to the state on behalf of the whole people of the country. And these large-scale extraction industries and locations have been the cause of immense conflict. I don't know if you know of the island of Bougainville. They had a 10-year civil war based on disagreements about environmental degradation, about the allocation of royalties, and about other aspects of land rights on the island of Bougainville. They have had peace treaties in place since about 1997, but they haven't resolved the problem, and it's 2026. They are moving toward an independent state that hasn't yet been fully endorsed by the parliament. But the issues there were copper, one of the largest open-cut copper mines in the world. Now, there are other large-scale mineral extraction operations in Papua New Guinea: gold, copper, oil, and the government's constantly having to ensure a balance between returns to the landowners of that immediate area, returns to the nation as a whole, and then within that return, a use in immediate budgets and conservation for the future through sovereign wealth funds. So, you've brought up really complex subject. How do you operate a sovereign wealth fund? Where do you invest that money? Who's in charge of it? How transparent is it? What is the basis for drawing it down and use? Because the needs are immense for civil construction, schools, hospitals, roads, all sorts of needs. Do you draw it down immediately and create those projects? So, for example, in Papua New Guinea, at the moment, there's a project simply to connect all of the provinces so that people who have road access to the rest of the country, it hasn't been in place. Now there's a project on it with a lot of controversy around it, cultural controversy and financial controversy, etc., environmental controversy. But that's just the government trying to connect its people. Okay, so you've talked about what is the economy. Now I've talked mostly about Papua New Guinea, but the smaller states of Vanuatu, Cook Islands, have a strong dependency on larger states through labor schemes or citizenship access. So for the case of Cook Islands, we started to talk about the idea of sort of association with other states. So the Cook Islands is not independent. It's independent in every manner except for defense and foreign affairs. Its people have the right to go and work in New Zealand. That takes an immense strain off the Cook Islands economy. Vanuatu is one state that has a strong a seasonal labor arrangement with Australia, where people come. It's not highly paid. It's fruit picking. It's not highly skilled. But on the other hand, those people take back to their country more income than they could earn in their own country. So, it's what do they do? Stay at home and not earn, or travel, get some international experience, and come back with some cash and some skills. So there are these labor schemes in place. There is behind this a larger debate as to freedom of movement of Pacific people. Not only, if you just the topic of the freedom of movement of Pacific people, how strong their passport is in the ability to go to other countries without a visa, let alone a work visa, but just a tourist visa, a travel visa, because of the inequalities between their economies. So we talked also about remittances, which have been very strong for countries like Samoa. People working in other countries, whether within the Pacific or in New Zealand, and remitting, and Fiji as well. Fijians moving to the United States. There are many. For example, there's an entire subculture of Fijian health workers who work in the United States, in some of the Midwest states, that have trouble attracting people into their aged care system. To be workers and carers there, and the Pacific people are able to go there and earn and take that revenue back. So that's not quite remittances. That's labor being allowed into certain areas of the economy in the US, New Zealand, Australia, Canada, etc. So let's just check what other aspects of your question about the economy. What we're saying is that the per capita income is very low in all Pacific states. You have a very small entrepreneurial class, which is setting up local businesses and struggling to assert its presence. When you get global rules, let's say you want to enter the World Trade Organization, and the World Trade Organization says you want to be a member, you have to open up your economy to goods and services from other countries. You want to look at the field of dentistry or medicine or pharmacy. You open up your small island state to any pharmacist from the world who wants to come and set up a pharmacy, you'll be flooded. Your locally educated pharmacists won't have a chance. So this is an example of a dilemma. Do you protect your economy and its people, or do you open to the world? The traditional philosophy is, well, if you open to the world, you'll get cheaper goods and services and more. Yes, you will, but at the expense of local people in those fields who won't have the levels of experience and training. So that's a dilemma that's in place. So it started by saying that there's a generally low level of income in the Pacific. Therefore, there's very few states in which there's a personal income tax because the cost of recovering it isn't equal to the return. So taxes go on commercial enterprises and natural resource extraction. Now, you said that when you talk about sovereign wealth funds, you can sort of worry about whether there's nepotism at the end of that, etc. But there's also a philosophy in some parts of the Pacific that the natural resources belong to the state. Now, in other parts of the world, natural resources belong to the lucky fellow who owns that land, and they happen to strike oil on their land and they get their revenue. But in the Pacific, that land often belongs to the sovereign rather than to that individual. Oh, you also mentioned you didn't understand how land rights work. Very little land in the Pacific has been alienated. Very little land has been alienated by the state. The land is owned in the greater proportion, more than 90%, is owned by the people. The issue is that it's owned collectively. So that if your clan has 400 members, that land's owned by 400. But if you're in a large clan of 30,000, your land is owned by 30,000. So if you've got natural gas on your land, or an oil pipeline, a gas pipeline goes through your land as it goes from the mountain areas to the sea, you will get royalties, but those royalties will be spread through that group. And that's justice, isn't it? Like everybody who's a member of that group. So blood lineage becomes important so that you get your share. And the same in Fiji. If there's a land group that's leasing out its land for, say, for sugarcane. So you've got cane farmers who are doing the work, but they're not the owners of the land. And the proceeds are managed by the state in such a way that they are distributed to the landowners. But those landowners, in the case of Fiji, are subject to a chief-based society in which chiefs have a higher rate of return than a commoner. So you've got a traditional justice in the quasi-colonial system that comes up against a modern system of justice, might say everybody should have an equal share. So that all of these things are in play. This is all the life world trying to work its way through into a just system. The other thing you mentioned at the beginning of that was attitudes toward conflict and the idea of unity. And I think that because these are small societies on small land masses that have to really make decisions that tend towards survival rather than extinction, that although they have histories of conflict, often those histories of conflict are with groups outside of their own, and they saw that as not conflict within our group, but conflict with others. But now with the emergence of states, nation states, that concept of who is the other has changed. And there's a constant desire to find ways to build unity within these states. And yet there are all these sources of conflict. So there's a tremendous tussle between the desire for solving conflict in traditional ways and reaching states of unity through negotiation. Pacific peoples are good negotiators, good at finding compromise. They're good in international dialogue because they are skilled at finding the common ground. They don't like conflict. Often conflict is suppressed and talked about privately and quietly rather than publicly. It's a loss of face if you're caught in a public conflict. So there's a lot of dignity in the way in which they address conflict. Oh, you're mute.
Thank you. I want to just touch a bit on another idea that I find significant. It just happened that I was reading recently some discussion about um, the richest families in the US and the UK. And somebody called Gabriel Zuckman has done a lot of work on how to tax the billionaires of such countries. And they have computed the number of families that seem to be at the top of the economic ladder. And I think he kind of mentions at some point that there's about 1,000 families in the United States and several hundred in the UK. And so that was at the back of my mind in general. Uh, and I mention that just to highlight that there is a lot about this discussion that relates to um, just the nature of the global economic system. So a lot of the art, like for example, the discussion about how workers go to Australia and New Zealand, that to me sounds like a clear example of dependency theory, right? And there's a part in your book where you kind of mention that in pre-modern times, specific societies were not stratified by class since much property was commonly owned. Um, but that with the evolution of cash economies, small elite, uh, small elite leading families have emerged at the center of government and commerce and maybe even public policy. And you mentioned that perhaps there's 100 families in the case of Vanuatu, Solomon Islands, and Tonga, and from several hundred to 1,000 families in Papua New Guinea, and that these families predominate in public sector leadership, legislature, statutory boards, state-owned enterprises, diplomatic posts, business interests, and so on. I was just first, I wanted to highlight that because it's a discussion everywhere. And so it's interesting that you see how by being inserted in the global system, the same issues appear there as here, as in the West.
Yeah.
On the other hand, I was just wondering how, again, how do you deal with that? And I mean, how what's to some extent you have to accept it because there has to be a structure in place and there is some maybe there are levels to that structure. um, it can't be perfectly horizontal, but but it is, I guess, a challenge, and we already touched on it in the politics section that we had.
Okay. So look, Pacific societies weren't classless; they were stratified.
Mm.
But whether they were stratified through achievement or through bloodline
Mm.
is the issue. Now, those traditional methods still exist. They parallel, so that in Polynesia, there are chiefly families who are known by name and rank and land ownership, and whose title is handed down within the family. There's differences, because this is a general conversation, there's differences in type of chiefly society. So, for example, in Samoa, there are known high chiefly families, but the holder of the title has to earn it. So there's dispute within the family. But in Tonga, it's not earned, it's a birthright in a sense, like the British system. So they're both chiefly systems, but they make fun of each other about what's required to be at the top of the chain. But implied in that, if there are chiefly systems, there are commoners who don't have the rank. Now, those commoners have more incentive to get education because that's the only way in which they can reach higher status and achievement. Now, in the Western Pacific, there are elements of chiefly society. Because of the complexity of what I'm talking about, indeed, there are some areas in which there is a hereditary system. But it's more generally the case that the chiefly system in Western Pacific is earned. And that's earned by doing your civic duty to your clan. But you don't earn, in the traditional system, you don't earn it by helping people outside the clan. That's under the modern civic system. But, to do it, to use your resources of your clan to help someone from another island in the country doesn't matter, because that's outside of the traditional system. But what we're talking about here is the rise of elites. So first of all, I said there were elites in traditional times. There were even elites in colonial times, those families that were prepared to fully cooperate with the colonial authorities and take on those roles and accept their authority. They got the best education. They didn't get suppression, etc. Whereas if you antagonize the colonial authorities to the extent of being exiled or being, having stripped of your entitlements, so it was quite brutal. Now, we're talking about contemporary times and the rise of elites. And I've said in my work that you can, by knowing someone's surname, you can know where they are in the elite. So I meet young people in the public service, and once they tell me their surname, I know something of their parents' generation or grandparents. Now, is this a good, bad thing, or is it just a natural thing? These elites hold their position there through access to education and opportunity. And, because they're in the capital cities, they understand how government works. They get to meet everybody who runs the government agencies. When it comes time for appointment to something, someone might say, well, I know that family. I know their father or whatever. Now, that doesn't imply it's nepotistic. It just implies that they know that person is good for that role. And they may be, because they're part of the educated elite who know about how the modern system works. The system only falls down if that person doesn't have the qualities and isn't appointed transparently and with merit. But these elites also then will do well in commerce, because people know their reputation, their family. They can start up a business. They can get a loan. If you're an unknown, poorly dressed, not well spoken, and you go to the bank for loans, they've got a good idea for a project on my land, you're far less likely to get a loan than somebody who's well dressed, whose parents have been in the media for 10 years. So it's a natural thing. Is it right or wrong? Well, it's a natural outcome of education and opportunity. It only becomes wrong when people are not able to join that emerging, growing economic community on the basis of, their origins. If they're suppressed in some way, if they don't get scholarships, if they're denied education. And the Pacific states are very aware of these, and they have policies of access for all, to the extent that in some countries they will allow students to progress in school even if they haven't passed well, because they want people to continue their education. So if you are an adult who 20 years ago didn't complete your primary school, but you now decide that you want to continue with education, you have an opportunity. So there are opportunities in the Pacific to overcome these gaps in society. There are proactive efforts being made. So what we're saying is, yes, there is definitely a clear elite. You can see them, you know their names, you see them operating in business, in civil society, in government, politics, in the diplomatic corps. They're all there. But on the other hand, there are opportunities for people to come from, and because I've had, we won't go into specific examples on an interview like this, but I've had village boys, through their ability, end up with well-paid positions with oil companies and gone for further training in the United States and doing quite well for themselves, coming out of a humble village setting. So it does occur.
Thank you. So that was more like a social reproduction issue. Thank you for that. I'm curious if, considering we've laid the context now pretty well, if you want to speak about public policy in any way, uh, you can do that. I would be interested. What I also want to hear for sure, I would like you to speak about regional integration because I think that's quite an important story. And then we'll see where we go after that, probably towards the global level after that. But yeah, that's.
When you talk about public policy, coming from from Western society, an ancient state like the UK or a well-developed governmental system like Australia or New Zealand, you presume that there's a well-developed public service, highly developed information systems, and analysts who can put options to government on every manner of public policy. Now, when you get to the small states, these presuppositions or assumptions don't hold. You may not have a solid knowledge base in a field, housing, transport, health. You may not have the data to make the right policy. You may not have the right analysts. You may be dependent on the data of international agencies. And when I started looking at public policy in the Pacific, I made the error of presuming that in every sector there was a policy. And I was in one Micronesian country many years ago, and a minister in that government said to me, "What makes you presume we have a policy for housing?" And I realized that was a presumption on my part. So the question always is, well, is there existing policy in a field? Is it operating? Is it effective? Who wrote it? Did it come from the colonial era? Was it policy written by an international agency? A UN agency said, you need policy in this area. Gender equality. You need this policy. Here's the policy. And it hasn't come from the life world. It's come from outside. Monetary policy, you need policy. Here's the policy. World Bank, IMF, will hand down a policy that's needed on Washington Consensus. This is how you need to do growth. So when we talk about public policy, it's another area in which a lot of the policy has been parachuted in rather than worked from what we need. And so you see this interplay between, there's a foreign policy. Did we generate it, or someone told us what should be in our policy, depending on who we're meant to be aligned with? So it's an interesting field in which policy is being elaborated in every area. A really interesting area is in ICT, telecommunications. What's the policy? Who gets to come into our country and run telecommunications systems? And what systems? And is it based purely on a profit foundation, or is it on an accessibility foundation? This is very interesting, because a company might come in and say, we can give you really efficient access in the main areas, the main urban areas, but we just won't go to the remote islands because, well, nobody's going to make a profit there, so they just have to wait. Or do you say, we'll let you into the country so long as you ensure coverage to the remotest islands in addition to the urban centers? So these are issues of access and the strength of that country to hold out that policy. Transport, say, okay, we'll bring in a ferry service, but we'll only do the main routes. So no, we need ferry services for each and every island. And we talked about small numbers. Some of the ferry services are not economic, but it's part of the deal if you're coming into our country. Air services, you can see where this is going. Land, transportation of goods over land, the same thing. So what's the policy and what's the access and equity of it? Are big topics. And there are many studies of equity in the Pacific because of this issue of the center and the periphery. Okay, so now public policy is only as effective as the ability of a public service to implement it and to monitor it and to evaluate it and to reform it. Otherwise, it's just a piece of paper. So when we talk about how healthy is policy in any Pacific country, we'd have to say, well, which sector? Is it indigenous? Is it something that homegrown? Does it meet needs? Is there sufficient backup from the state? What is the role of civil society in that and the community in understanding the policy? And you get to things like, gender equality or the rights of women and children. You can have a piece of paper. Yes, you can have a piece of paper. But how well is that policy enforced in a village or in a country town or on a particular island? And if it's not understood and agreed to, then it's not a public policy. It's something else. So that's the policy side. And then that leads on to whether how that policy is enforced, whether it's through law or through resources or education, depends on what it is. But the adequacy of legal backup to a policy is really important as well. So I think you mentioned something after that as well, but public policies okay, so I distinguish between domestically generated public policy and global public policy. And the observation is that many policies gain their impetus from global standards. I'll give an example like the quality of water. Now, if you had every country setting its own standards for the quality of water that was for human consumption or for agricultural use or industrial use, some countries simply wouldn't have the scientific ability to do that. And others may not have the desire to do it because they just like to say, oh, all our water's clean, what's your problem? So there's a role for setting global, whether it's international standards or global standards, for some matters that affect fundamental human development. Another interesting one is standards for education and what it means to be literate. This would be of interest to you. Our country is 97% literate. Well, what do you mean by literate? Can you mark X on the spot for your signature, or can you read the sentence? Do you have primary education or some grades of secondary? What is the standard to say we have a literate society? And these debates have gone on within the education community globally for years, trying to set standards for literacy. And I think there's a role for that in the Pacific, so that standards are in place that are have some legitimacy and set a standard for these countries. Transportation safety. Is it safe to have 10 children sitting in the back of a truck going at 90 kilometers an hour? What's the law? Because we've always done that. If we don't have that, how are we going to get so many people transported around? But a safety regulation that says that passengers must be in safe vehicles, etc. So this is global public policy at work, and it goes through every aspect of policy. I've emphasized the ones that are to do with human development, health and education, food standards, fish poisoning from local markets. Okay, it's good that you've got people in the informal sector who go fishing and then put their fish by the side of the street and sell it, and they can take home some coin. But are there standards around the safety of those fresh products? So there's a role for public policy, even in the simplest of settings, for the benefit of people. Because, if you look up the instances of fish poisoning in the Pacific, it'll be much higher than other parts of the world. I don't know which direction you want to go with that question on public policy, but I'm saying there's a role for global standards and their enforcement for the benefit of people of the Pacific. It's a burden. It's onerous, it's hard, but it's for the benefit of people in the raising of standards of human development.
Thank you. I think you've managed to make public policy sound exciting, at least.
Oh, it's extremely exciting. It wasn't until I looked at it, and it's surprising that in many small states it's simply not taught as a discipline. And so I observed that there may be quite a few people in senior positions who didn't have a concept. And I once had a PhD student we sent around the Pacific asking these people, what does public policy mean to you? To see what the answer was. And that's when we learned the extent to which it wasn't understood that the value of public policy to the benefit of that society and all the people in it.
The other theme I linked this to was regional integration,
Oh,
because
yes.
I
Okay.
see a link at the level of, so I see, or my understanding is that the realm of public policy is where you can address a lot of the challenges we've highlighted if you have the right elements, from leadership to an educated population and so forth. So both top and bottom have to contribute. And and so I see regional integration as an area where you're able to tackle issues policy-wise on a different scale that might be needed. That's why I've
That's
linked
the
them
dream.
together. Yeah.
That's the
So
dream.
if you could speak a bit about the regional integration and the different
Let
trade
me be
agreements.
provocative and say
Yeah.
that there's no regional integration.
Okay.
There's regional collaboration and there are regional organizations. But whether there's yet any regional integration is an interesting question. After the Second World War, the South Pacific Commission was formed, with leading actors being Australia, New Zealand, France, USA, Great Britain, one or two others, maybe even Germany, I'm not sure. And they were looking to raise the socioeconomic standards of the Pacific. It is entirely non-political, just raising standards of economy and health and education. And so it dealt with agriculture and, getting rid of fruit fly and, all these sorts of things. And it was based in Noumea, which is a French colony. And it was active from the 1940s and still continues. It's called the Pacific Community now. So, and you can look it up, and it's a wonderful organization. It's a knowledge organization. A lot of the scientific data for the Pacific comes from the Pacific Community. It's a regional organization that not many people know about. And one of the reasons I wrote my book was to highlight these important regional organizations and their role. Now, by the 1960s, when the Pacific colonies were wanting independence, they found that the rules of the South Pacific Commission forbade any discussion of politics. But they wanted to discuss politics, and they wanted to discuss decolonization. So they formed their own organization called the South Pacific Forum. And they allowed this forum to be the place in which they could discuss decolonization. And so you had two regional organizations, one which was more technical and one which allowed for policy and for politics. And indeed, the South Pacific Forum, which is now called the Pacific Islands Forum, because, at the time it was called South Pacific, and then the Micronesians say, well, what about us? So back in the 60s, they were still very much under American control, and that they weren't in any position to join this organization. But they gradually joined through the 70s. And you can see on the website of the Secretariat of the Pacific Islands Forum, you can see the timeline in which countries joined. And again, that's why we call Pacific Island countries, not Pacific Island nations. They may not have national sovereignty. They may have some form of a compact of free association with France or US or New Zealand and still be part of this organization. And they have striven since the 1970s toward collaboration, global advocacy, particularly within the UN, particularly in the committee for the Committee of 24, the Decolonization Committee on behalf of the French territories, and also advocacy against nuclear weapons testing. These were the two issues. In more recent years, it's been advocacy for climate change um, adaptation and funds to come in to support that, and security treaties, um, and dealing with internal conflicts in the Pacific, setting security protocols by which Pacific nations could help each other to overcome their conflicts. Now, the question of integration as compared to collaboration, where do you turn from model of multinational integration? You turn to the European Union. Is that the model? Did the European Union have the same goals as the Pacific Island nations, and a desire for the same sort of political format? If you can get some insights from the political union, which started as an economic community. Here's a big problem with the Pacific integration. It's very hard to have an economic community because they have nothing to trade with each other. There's nothing that Papua New Guinea wants from Solomon Islands. There's nothing Solomon Islands wants from that. They've all got coconuts. They've all got fish. They've all got a tourism industry. There's nothing to trade. They can't have an economic community. What they can have is economic relations with outside sectors, particularly in fuel, because they all need fuel. Shipping, they all need shipping. They formed the University of the South Pacific. 12 countries co-own the university. It's one of the few multinational universities similar to the University of the West Indies. So there's a model there for collaboration, but that's not political integration in any way. So there have been calls in the early 2000s for political integration, and attention was turned to the Caribbean, which has a far stronger structure of political commitment. We won't say integration, but commitment. Judicial, in policy. But there's also a feeling that there are challenges in the Caribbean community, both on the economic side and on the disproportionate weight of the large Caribbean countries and the small. And the same thing would happen in the Pacific. If you're putting the weighting by population, all the votes would go to Papua New Guinea. If you do the allocation of votes by individual countries, Papua New Guinea will say, well, look, you've got all these small countries making decisions, but their economy doesn't add up to anything near ours. So these problems of disproportion weigh against the probability of political integration. There have been very specific efforts to advocate a Pacific Islands Union, but it hasn't made any progress. The elements that bring the Pacific together are shared concern about climate change and security. And they didn't succeed in getting a common cause in bulk purchase of fuel. They didn't succeed in collaboration on a shipping line, notwithstanding the fact that shipping is one of their major needs. So it's a work in progress. The idea of talking about large ocean states is a harmonizing theme that keeps them together, because that's what they do share. But it's not a political union, and it's not an economic integration.
Thank you. I think that was really something that clarified a lot of things for me, and I think it's hard to get this information in general. It's very, very interesting. Okay, let's go to the global level, and maybe UN related stuff, if that's useful. And I guess there's several ways we could go about this. I could just ask you, how do Pacific states or other large ocean states engage with the global system? how do they participate in the global order? There are contributions they have made on the nuclear issue, on the law of the sea, on climate change, on one of the sustainable development goals, I think number 14, which is specifically about rights for the sea, to the sea. And then there's something which is described as the emergence of small islands, developing states, discourse, development discourse. So that's like it's basically a, a new development discourse that focuses or centers on the needs, specific needs of smaller island countries, and that's a significant development, I think. So wherever you want to go on this question.
Yeah. The small island states see the global environment or apparatus as a game to be played. And the first decades of engagement were to see what could be obtained from these global agencies. And it's the UN system that sets the definitions of least developed states and medium developed states, less developed countries, medium developed countries. And this particular committee that has a very sophisticated algorithm that puts together economic values, human values, and determines which countries are in the LDC category. And they give them incentives, they give them special dispensations in the international economic order. So this sets up perverse incentives for the Pacific to
let me just mention that the LDC means least developed countries, right?
Yes, the least developed countries. Yes, and you can look this up. And so, ironically, rather than being a system that encourages countries to move from LDC status into a medium development, they lose some privileges. And so, for a number of years, countries like Samoa argued that they hadn't developed. They were still in the LDC status because they would lose some privileges. So this game playing goes on there. But in general, when we study the entry of all the UN agencies to the Pacific, whether it's FAO, UNDP, ILO, just every single one, for the first couple of decades, the Pacific states saw that as access to funding, access to project support. So the emphasis was on what is the size of the envelope for Pacific states that is coming from a particular agency, and how much of that envelope can we accrue to our particular country by looking vulnerable, in the health sector or the agriculture or transport or telecommunications or whatever. That's still in place because funds are required. But the other side of that transaction is to see what role the Pacific states can play in the global system. And there's huge problems there based on size. So what the study shows, the book shows, is that if you want to engage in international agencies in Brussels, Geneva, Addis Ababa, Nairobi, Bangkok, New York, you need a secretariat, you need residences, you need offices, you need a budget, and it's extremely expensive. So the size of delegations from the small states has always been smaller than required. The delegations have never had sufficient numbers to be able to attend all of the international meetings they would like to attend. They have to make choices. So there's a strain on the small Pacific states to adequately represent themselves, particularly in New York and Geneva. It's an ongoing struggle, they pool their resources. So that, for example, they might have one member who will go to a particular high-level meeting and send a report to the other Pacific states. So they share. So that there is a sharing going on. When it comes to major, all the major global conferences on environment, on human rights, and you might have seen the chart in the book, on every area where a delegation was required to report to the global community on what's happening and to hear reports of other countries, it's been a challenge for Pacific states to be there. So when you're talking about entry into global public policy dialogue and engagement with global institutions, it's a resource-heavy event. Also, the Pacific states have regular multilateral dialogue with regional partners, Japan, China, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, the USA. The leaders go regularly as a group to consult. It's not bilateral, that's another level, but there's multilateral. So they're going to those meetings as well as sending delegations to the global meetings. So it's a vast area of, and the other elements to this is one thing to go to a meeting and understand what's happening in that field and bring that back as a new standard, particularly for human rights. Who has raised the standard of human rights in the Pacific other than the UN? No country. Australia didn't do it. Germany didn't do it. Japan didn't do it. No one has raised the standard of human rights for women, children, men, the disabled than the UN. So the Pacific has to be very grateful for this interest taken by global agencies in them as small states and spreading those standards. But on the flip side of that, you could call it the burden of reporting, that every time a small state signs to a treaty, that treaty will have reporting commitments. And climate change is one. Okay, climate change is important, we will sign the treaty. Then the treaty says every year you have to attend a global meeting and report on what you've done. That requires back home a sophisticated knowledge management system, acquisition of information on the ground, what's happening, writing into a report that's acceptable at the global level, etc. So there's a huge burden on justice departments, labor departments, foreign affairs in general, to reach those reporting standards. And there are very many international commitments that Pacific states have made that have been underreported. They simply haven't filed the reports because they haven't had the staff to complete those reports and get them in. So I've talked about two aspects to this. One is what the Pacific can do for what the UN agencies can do for the Pacific in bringing in human and material resources, finances, and then what the Pacific can do within the international agencies. And one idea I've had is that if we want to know whether an international agency is globally fair and globally just, is its ability to respond to the interests and needs of small states as effectively as it can to the needs and interests of medium-sized and large states. In other words, if you have a global agency that responds more rapidly to the expressed interests and needs of the large states and ignores those of the small states, it's not a global organization. You can call it an international organization in which, you know, the rights and interests of nations are debated and bartered in an international arena. You can call it that. But a global organization is one which meets the needs of its members regardless of their size. So that's the way in which small states can test the validity and fairness of the UN. The United Nations, does it meet their needs? And that's when you get into such areas as the formation of the small island developing states, which are not just the Pacific, but there are about 50 of them around the world, all the small states in the Indian Ocean, the Atlantic. There are small states, and they get together occasionally for conferences that bring the level down to the really small, the micro states. And there hasn't been much significant action in that area for the last couple of years, and I think it's because climate change in the other arenas has taken the more attention.
That was extremely interesting and very useful to know and to learn about. Um, okay, I think we have gone through a lot. What I want to ask next is about the global, the global mindset that one should have and the fields that deal with this. So, on the one hand, you can talk about global studies, which is an academic field that relates to some of these issues. On the other hand, you have advanced, I guess, the discourse of global public policy, and that's another way you could frame this. What how do you think about this, about how we prepare a way to develop a global mindset to deal with the global challenges we have, and what are some of the critical questions in that space?
I think there's an ethos of global mindedness, which is simply that value system that says that the rights of all people, regardless of where they live, regardless of continent, the rights of all people are legitimate. But that ethos is very abstract, and I think that it needs to be backed up with a growing empirical base of understanding. So, for example, myself as an Australian who knows something of the Pacific, but I know very little about the conditions in Africa. I really know little about conditions worldwide. So do I have a global mindset? Well, I have a global ethos. I want to think globally, but do I have the data set? So I've always been looking for organizations that can present global data in a way that says that all of the countries represented in this data have equal value. So you get interesting organizations like OECD that you always think of as just the organization of, developing countries, OECD. But they have an interesting global development. And indeed, the UN systems have a lot of global information in them, but it's very complex to try and draw it out. The World Bank has global systems of data, as does IMF. And then you get other organizations that don't have global in their name, like the World Economic Forum, which often people think of as sort of an elite body. But when you look at their data sets, they don't cover every country, but they're trying to encapsulate the dynamics of the world system. And there are these earlier models that the Club of Rome attempted, and I think the Earth Foundation on environmental models before computing power was equal to the task. They had the aspiration. So when you ask about a global mindedness, I'm suggesting that it's one thing to have the value set in place, but it's very different to be able to comprehend what a global policy setting should be without data. What is fair for all people? What in trade relations, or another thing that I really puzzle at is that everybody talks about security and security organizations, but the moment you refer to the concept of global collective security, their eyes glaze over. Even the UN doesn't talk about global collective. They talk about security pacts, on the continents or between like-minded groups and etc. But each of those security pacts causing insecurity, whether in Southeast Asia or East Asia or in Europe. So I don't find in very many places a global mindset in place that is truly interested in the progress of the planet as a whole. Even so, a lot of the global meetings, particularly the climate change meetings, are still a meeting place for the bartering of national interests. Okay, well, we'll reduce our emissions to this rate if you do to that rate. And because you're not coming down quickly enough, we won't come down either, because that's unfair. You're being more economically active than we are. This is national interests being debated in a global arena. It's not global mindedness. So I'm not yet optimistic on that. I'm looking for organizations that not only speak of being global minded, but demonstrate the data sets and the policy settings that will get us there.
I have to ask at least one more question, and that's regarding the challenges and the changes that this year has brought. For example, there is a lot less foreign aid going around, from what I understand. That is likely to impact some of the countries in the Pacific. I wonder if that has already happened, or you think it might not happen. From what I understand, I mean, just the demise of US aid, I'm not sure to what extent they were involved in the region, but in other countries where they were involved, that has been really significant, and that has coupled with, really high prices for oil and gas and for some of the fertilizers, and that's likely to impact food. There's some talk about some serious weather events this year that is going to hit at the same time. That those are going to hit at the same time with the food crisis that might come up from the lack of fertilizers. I'm not sure within that constellation of potential challenges how the region sits within that. If so, that would be one question. The other question is, we should have touched on it, and I haven't. It's my fault, but I would like to hear a little bit more about women and gender equality as a challenge. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Foreign aid is very transactional, and there's a lot of bilateral aid, which is clearer transaction than multilateral aid or aid from global organizations. And so while there is definitely a reduction in US aid to the region, monetary and British as well, has reduced. Other countries are increasing their aid to the Pacific, but as I say, it's very transactional. It might be tied to agreements on support in other fora where that country is needing votes, and so you become friends with the country and support them in some ways because you know that you'll be building votes for something that you need in a totally different arena. So it's a very transactional issue. There was it was called the Busan Declaration on Aid Effectiveness, and there were 5 principles that came out. It was a conference. It did have the UN support, but it was primarily OECD, and they said, look, since the Second World War, we've been giving aid around the world to the so-called developing countries. And we're just wondering how effective it's been. And so they set some principles in place to look at aid effectiveness. And I think that's drawn attention to some of the limitations of just giving aid without looking at whether the results are owned, who owns the results, who's responsible for the outcomes? Do countries simply receive project money and not worry about whether it's successful or not, because it wasn't our project, it was given by the EU or was by someone else. And if it didn't work, well, we'll just apply for some more. And rather than looking at the actual impact of that. So that's had an impact on looking at aid effectiveness and the outcomes and the ownership and sustainability of aid. So there has been a change there in awareness of the need for recipient countries to own the outcomes of the aid that's given. I'm not on top of the exact levels of aid at the moment, but there are plenty of organizations that track that to see whether the aid flows are in place or not. Now, from the aid question, you mentioned another one before you got to the issue of gender. What was that one?
I probably mentioned oil and gas and, the impact on prices, and also there's some expectation of climate change challenges like bigger storms and things like that.
Oh, right. Okay. Well, one of the interesting things there is that, storms have always come through the Pacific, but the Pacific had less infrastructure to damage. It had less roads and bridges and housing and multi-level housing and communications equipment like satellite dishes. So a cyclone that came through in the 1950s simply did less damage. If houses were destroyed, people rebuilt them with natural materials, and they'd done that for thousands of years. That was the sustainable approach, because they've been having these cyclones. There's been a cyclone season every year for countless, generations, thousands of years. And you knew it was coming. You could tell by the weather patterns. You would protect all your personal goods as best you could. And if your house got completely destroyed, you just rebuild it. Now, if you're in an era of concrete and steel, and you don't build to cyclone standards, then you get this tremendous damage. And so there's been a history through the 70s, 80s, 90s of devastation of infrastructure. The cyclones weren't necessarily any different, but the infrastructure was different. So now we talk about policy settings. You now need to build to cyclone standards. The roofing, the foundations, all the entry points, the drainage. If you're going to build roads, see, we didn't have all those roads in place. Bitumen roads with side drainage just wasn't in place. Roads just get washed away. Then you just sort of maybe grader it, just use a grader and get a dirt track in place again. Now you've got bitumen roads and bridges over cute little creeks that become raging torrents and just sweep the bridge away. So there's been a lot of learning there about infrastructure. And, the World Bank, through its infrastructure projects, has literally mapped the Pacific and knows every piece of infrastructure in the Pacific. Every piece is known. It's quite impressive. And so the upgrading of infrastructure to withstand the natural conditions is one of the interesting progressive. It's not complete, but as things get knocked down by a cyclone, when they're rebuilt, you can't rebuild it unless you do it to standard. Yeah, so that's happening. But it looks like the devastation is greater than previously. Well, it is, but it's new infrastructure. So Vanuatu, for example, prides itself on they have cyclones, and they pride themselves on the ability to batten down their satellite dishes and not have them destroyed. And within 24 hours, they've got their satellite system back up and running because they've paid attention to it. And they've got a very sophisticated approach to ICTs. So these are the other side to that. It's not all a story of mismanagement or backward steps in meeting environmental challenges. Now you mentioned issues of gender and women. The status of women differs across the Pacific. There are a few societies in which the position of women is equal to men, or in some cases have greater status than men. But those are not the majority. The majority would have to be the case that they were patriarchal societies. There might be balance, for example, the patriarchal societies, but women control land, or women control aspects of, say, marriage choices, or so that there was always some offset to that. But in general, because men were more physically strong, they ended up in those positions of power. Now, in terms of women in politics, the Pacific is the black spot on the world's map. And if you look at the mapping of the Interparliamentary Union, you'll see that the Pacific parliaments consistently over 4 decades have had less female members. There have been just very rare instances of female prime ministers, maybe Samoa. The president of Palau has been female. But, Palau has a different dynamic between male and female. I have a lot of admiration for the Palauan traditional society and their strength in the face of modernity, but that's a different sort of story. So in the Papua New Guinea Parliament of more than 100, there might be 1 or 2 women at the current time. The most it's been is 4. In some other parliaments, they haven't had any. So it's a black spot, and there's a lot of effort goes into the training of female candidates. I don't know that that's going to be necessarily the answer, because it means that not only, if women aren't being elected, it means that not only men are not voting for women, but women are not voting for women, because so it's a matter of civic engagement as well as trying to build the capacity of candidates. Now, in the public sector, what I've observed is that the head of department is much less often a female, the head of department. But under the head of department, you'll often find a large number of highly proficient females who are at the deputy secretary level or the director level, and they're doing the bulk of the work. So there's a deeply embedded core or cadre of women in the public service throughout the Pacific, but they don't get represented at the head of that department. That's the ceiling at the moment, and that's what they have to break through. So I've said in politics, very low level. In public sector, it's higher, but not necessarily at the level of head of department. Judiciary, not at the level of chief justices. At the magistracy, yes. In the lower courts, there are women. In business, there are women who are leading companies, leading their own small businesses or medium size. Maybe it's a more modern sector to be in, or more leeway for them to do that. The Pacific states are amongst the least signatories to the human rights treaties. So they talk about human rights, but go and look at the treaty accession, signing to treaties of human rights, the Pacific, because of their conservative societies. And I won't call out any particular countries, because you can see it in the charts, where some of them actively advocated against the equality of women because it was not in accord with their traditions. So this is an example where the life world has to find its role, because they say, how dare you impose on us equality of women? That's not our tradition, not our value. But that comes up against the younger women in those societies will say, hey, well, that, your grandparents was one matter, but we, the younger generation, want that equality. And this is where the life world has to reach a stage where they say, we will sign those treaties and we will ensure equality of women. And it's the same for the position of children, that have their rights are far less recognized in the Pacific than in other states, just by looking at the signage of the covenant on the rights of the child. The ability of young women to finish schooling, the differential in that is quite high in the Pacific, so there's a long way to go. There's a lot of advocacy in the Pacific by women's groups and groups advocating the rights of children. Children working on the land in their family businesses rather than going to school. Parents say, I need you. I can't, this family won't survive unless you go out and earn some income, because they've got such low levels of income. So those are gradually increasing, but there's a big differential there.
Thank you. That's very comprehensive. You've mentioned Palau, and I'm really curious now because when I was reading your book, to myself, I was kind of thinking that Palau seems to be a good place because different indicators were quite good compared to other countries. And then Fiji, I had some questions about because, for example, I think I remember there was quite high inequality in terms of the data I was looking at. And it's not the country that it's one of the countries that has a larger GDP. So it's a bit strange that it was very unequal, highly unequal, considering there are resources. So there is, in my mind, there is a sort of not opposition, but I look at Palau in a more positive light, and I look at Fiji as well. There are some real challenges here. Is that the wrong assumption? Is it correct? How do you take
Well,
this?
um,
I don't want to compare them as much as to, like what is it that impressed you about Palau and where does Fiji stand on, in terms of what impresses you positively or negatively?
can't quite define why it was that the people of Palau had such a strong coherence that they maintained much of their political autonomy all through the period of not only Japanese occupation, but then US occupation. The US wanted all of the North Pacific states to come together as one, say, federated states of Micronesia. There was in 1965 something called the Congress of Micronesia, which the idea was, okay, well, if America is going to withdraw and allow you to be sort of at least self-governing, if not independent, why don't you all just stay together and we'll treat you as one body? And the Palauans said, no, we're not part of that. And they didn't go with their neighbors in the Federated States of Micronesia that has 4 states in the federation. And yet within the Republic of Palau, there are 14 states. There are 14 states, and some have as few as 1,500 citizens. So in the literature, it's often been sort of compared to sort of ancient Athens, sort of Greek city-states. So there's 2 things that I admire about Palau. One is that they have oil, deep sea oil, which they have refused to exploit because they value the pristine nature of their island system more than the revenue from the oil. Secondly, that in their system of government, although there are flaws in it, but they have 2 high-ranking traditional chiefly officers that they built into the constitution as being equal in rank to the elected president. So we started talking earlier about where culture stands, and in most of the contemporary constitutions, traditional authority was either completely ignored or sidelined to an advisory council with no power. But I once was in Palau at a meeting of the president, who was seated side by side with these 2 high chiefs. Now, there's conflicts there between what the traditional chiefs want and what the elected president wants, but it's that balancing of interests that allows them to go ahead. Now, I won't dwell on the fact that Palau refused its final agreement with the United States because it it was a completely non-nuclear state and would not allow the visit of nuclear vessels. I won't go down that track, but the point is that my point is that they stood up to the weight of US pressure on that issue, and they said no, and it delayed their independence by a decade or more. So there's a lot to admire about them culturally, economically, and in terms of the political system they have in place. There are other smaller dimensions to that about, for example, how they develop their public prosecution system to make sure it's independent. It's all different things. But so I've always admired that about them. And they seem to have maintained a high level of human development despite being a very small country. So that's a bit about Palau. And the people I've met, the officials I met from Palau, the diplomats have been well-spoken, intelligent, well-educated, very impressive. So a small state taking its place in the public arena and the global spaces with confidence was what I admired.
Thank you. I think that covers most of my questions. Well, you haven't said much about Fiji. You want to have a go on Fiji as well?
Well, Fiji was a British colony. It came to independence in 1970. But it came to independence with a legacy. You may know this of indentured labor brought from the southern part of India, which was another British colony, and it was in a sense done in agreement with the Fijian leaders at the time, where the British said, "Look, we won't interfere with your lifestyle. You just continue to have your lifestyle. We'll bring in some people to do the work." And this set up an imbalance between Fijians with less incentive to work and the indentured labor that had to work very, very hard to survive. And these two communities came to independence, still trying to find some accommodation. And of course, then you had extreme views as to whether they should be returned home. The Indo-Fijians themselves said, well, we don't have anywhere to go in India. We're Fijian. We live here. We're born here. So it's a biracial society, which is learning to acknowledge both the rights of the indigenous Fijians as well as the rights of Indo-Fijian citizens, all of whom are contributing to the progress of that country. But it's been a very difficult road. They've had they've had four coups. One was, in a sense, a civilian coup. It's a very complex history. And they're still recovering. At the moment, there's a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in place at the moment to try to finally bring some resolution to these long-standing issues, which have dented the rate of progress of the economy and the people. A population of roughly 500,000, with high aspirations in terms of development. It has a well-developed tourism industry and beautiful islands. I've mentioned the sugar industry has struggled. It has a small industry, but on the global stage, by the time you export a small amount of Fiji sugar anywhere, it doesn't compare in cost to larger exporters who have less distance to their markets. They had favorable conditions for a garment industry and a footwear industry under agreements with European community, but those have expired. And so those industries basically disappeared. So you've got tourism, maybe some fishing, and local produce, and an education industry based on their universities. But so I think that's an example of a country that's still coming to terms, even though decolonization was decades ago. The remnants of that era still impose themselves on Fiji today.
From what I remember reading in your book, the British period um, resulted in a very hierarchical system. So they were
Not
they're
resulted in, not resulted in.
created.
It acknowledged what was there. You see, it used it was called a system of indirect rule that they had learned about in Africa. That they come in, they assert control of the territory, but they leave the local leaders in place and say, you just keep doing what you're doing. They did even out some aspects of language and style of chiefly authority because that changed between the islands. But basically, the system in place of clans and then larger clans headed by um, a chiefly authority at the top, um, that was already in place, and they just acknowledged it. And the question for Fiji is how you continue to, what role do you give to that system of chiefly authority and clan coherence, because it has a role in solidarity, but how does that um, interact with the modern state of Fiji? And it's something that the Fijians are still working on. It's not an easy thing because you don't want to go to one string. You don't want to say, okay, we're going to leave the chiefly system behind and all our system is social integration. And that because that controls land management, allocation of resources, allocation of position in society. So you can't leave it behind. On the other hand, you can't fully rely on it because it's not based on the quality of persons, not based on the quality of opportunity. So the Fijians, and that's why I can't say more as someone who sort of as a friend of Fiji, that I can observe it, but I can't comment on the future of that. That's up to the Fijians to sort that out.
Thank you. That's extremely useful to know. I think you have been excellent. I don't have any more questions. That's all I had. If you want to add anything else, please feel free. I really appreciate what you have given us through this interview. I really like the fact that you always seem to be balanced and clear-eyed, and you strike this really amazing balance between realism and idealism without losing sight of any of the two. And yeah, and you make public policy exciting, which is which is really important. Um, I think I'm thinking that maybe I would like to share my screen and show some of your books. Let's see if
Okay.
I can do that.
This is where we say, if anybody is still watching this interview, this is, uh,
Yeah, if I can do it. One second.
okay. Shall I mention that one first, or
Yeah,
you wanted to
can
look at
you
those?
mention it? Oh, okay. So
Well,
here it comes. Anyways,
yeah, yeah.
um,
Um, oh, okay.
this is the one I was able to look at, government and
Right,
public policy in the
right.
Pacific Islands.
Yeah,
I've also managed to look a little bit at this one, which is
yeah,
newer, more
yeah.
recent. I think there's splendid books from what I've seen, and then there's a third one that I have not looked at and we haven't touched on here. But
Right.
you have also
What else
been.
have you got in that list? Is that all you've got?
This is
That's all you
guys.
got?
This is actually Amazon UK, so
You're right.
it's what
Yeah,
Amazon has.
yeah,
This is the next one. It's
yeah,
not. It's not the full. This is just Amazon
yeah.
UK. We can maybe get
Interesting.
more
Okay.
books.
No, it doesn't matter.
I
But
mostly wanted to share the ones I
yeah,
looked at for this
yeah.
interview.
Well, okay. Well, look, let me just mention a few things about these, um, because there is a tremendous amount of literature on the Pacific Islands, but it's not in the global discourse. And what I wanted to do with this was to write something that was published by a global publisher, which is Springer. So yes, it costs a lot of money for those who want to buy it, but because it's Springer, it appears in library catalogs around the world, and so students can see it there. Students and academics, and anybody has access to those libraries. And once they click on the electronic version, it invokes a purchase of that book. But they have access to it. I've done other books which are published by New Zealand publishers, and they're only available in New Zealand. They're not appearing here. They get out of print, and so you do a lot of work. And for example, one is social policy in practice. Is that focused or
Yeah, social
yeah,
policy
things like
practice and
that?
processes.
And yeah, and the other one that I thought was a useful contribution was with this one, a seat at the table, which is
Yeah.
about New Zealand in the
United
as
Nations.
an elected member of the Security Council.
Oh,
But my my learning from that was that you do all that effort, and when it's not a global publisher, it's only known locally. And I think part of my mission is to bring Pacific studies to a global audience, which is why I chose Springer for that. Um, and the same with the digital government book for that same reason. And then the other book on government public policy through Emerald, a global publisher. And the fact that there are many people in policy studies who don't study management, and there are people in management studies who don't study policy. And so I very, very purposefully called it government and public policy because it looks at the two. And I think that was an important thing. So, well, thanks, Philip, for showing those and showing an interest in this work, which is really niche. You know, a lot of people don't spend any time looking at the Pacific because it's not as large or as significant in world affairs as other parts of the world. But the perspective I've tried to show is that if we're to be global minded, we have to enter into that global mindedness from where we happen to be. And because with my Baha'i background, I had this experience once of I was living in Papua New Guinea, and I traveled to the Eastern Highlands of Papua New Guinea, and I met some of the village people. And then there was a large Baha'i conference in New York, 1992. So I lived in Papua New Guinea in 1991, and then this large conference in 1992. And I see this man on the street, and I know he's this villager from the Highlands, and it's his first time out of his country. And I said to him, "Are you nervous here in New York?" And he said, "No." He said, "In some parts of the world, we have villages, in some parts, we have cities, and this is my city." And, just a lot to learn from that global mindedness of a humble village man whose house I'd seen. So I learned a lot from that. And so the idea is that you can be global minded from wherever you are, your situation, and then you grow it out from there, which is why, I could have studied European studies or just Australian studies, but it wouldn't allow me that entry point into seeing the global system from this vantage point of this part of the world. So that was the motivation behind my work. And I thank you so much for taking the time to ask a few questions today. It's been wonderful to have somebody show that detailed interest, read the material, ask the questions. It's a great project you're doing, just to have conversations with people. And I wish you all the best with many future conversations from different parts of the world as you and I strive to become global minded, despite all the limitations on our ability to do so. So thanks so much.
thank you so much. I really appreciate it, and I think we will end here. Thank you.